Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm Mickey Huff with Eleanor Goldfield, and Eleanor and I are joining each other in this segment after you just heard an excellent conversation she had about what's happening with Venezuela and global affairs. We're going to kick off our first segment of Is This the Best We Can Do, coupled with the most underreported stories of the last week or month, as it were, and we'll go into some highlights or lowlights about the state of our so-called free press. And Eleanor, why don't we kick things off with an unfortunate yet recurring topic about the things that the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print, the way in which they choose to frame the word choices they use, how they report on important matters of the day. You made a quip about this, of course, last week. And then, of course, most recently, we see the BBC, not to be outdone across the pond, also had a memo about language and certain types of terms that their reporters should and shouldn't use when talking about the illegal invasion and abduction of a country's president. But without giving away too much more, Eleanor, uh, help us out. Help us understand this. Words.
Uh, yes, words have meaning, don't they? I mean, even in this quote unquote post-truth world, Mickey, words still mean something, or we try to make them, which is, of course, why critical media literacy is so important because words are chosen very purposely for headlines such as the New York Times, when the New York Times, in their boldest print, wrote Maduro captured to refer to the illegal and criminal kidnapping of a democratically elected head of state. And as you pointed out, the BBC wanting to, show Uncle Sam that they could, hold my beer. There was a memo that was sent out to BBC staff following a morning meeting that was described as wanting to ensure clarity and consistency in our reporting, describing the events in Venezuela. Uh, Captured, it says, please attribute this to the U.S. description of the operation. The quote example, the US said Maduro was captured. Avoid using kidnapped. So it's one thing if you're saying, okay, the US said this, and then you say, but really what this is kidnapping. No, 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 no. You're not allowed to use that word. Don't use kidnapped. Um, and it says C is acceptable for use in our own reporting where appropriate, which sounds like one of those things where it's like, I guess I'll just self-censor because what does that even mean where appropriate? Seizing is obviously an act an act that involves force. But if you're trying to avoid that, if you're not saying kidnapped, when are you allowed to use the word
Escorted.
seize?
He was
Yeah,
escorted from his home with his wife in the middle of the night. He was safely ushered from one place to another. Hey, and listen,
and this is what's really funny, by the way, is that even Trump said that he doesn't mind using the word kidnapped. So
and he
I
called him
like
president, regardless of what one says about the last election with the Maduro and the controversies that surround it. Trump himself referred to him as President Maduro.
right. And but that's a thing, right? And I know that you're gonna get into the whole Stephen Miller thing in a minute, but like this is the example of the press running
Mhm.
interference for the state when the state's like, I don't care. I'll show everybody how horrific I am. It's no big deal to me. I'll call it kidnapping. And the New York Times is like, no, we can't call it kidnapping. And the BBC's like, no, we
Wait,
couldn't possibly. And it's like,
yeah,
but the people who did the thing are calling it that. Like,
yeah. Well,
why can't you report what they
it's
said?
up for the press to launder it, right? As AJ Liebling said, freedom of the press belongs to those who own one. And the owners, we know, the billionaire class, we know what side they're on. So they have to play a little bit of cleanup there. But my goodness, it's becoming much more difficult. It's almost as if we're pining for the good old days of 2003, where Colin Powell prepared false statements to go to the UN to try to cajole and convince people that there was some legitimate reason to invade, Iraq again. But they went through these elaborate charades. Now, I mean, now they're just like, look, you quibble about what you want to call it. We're calling it a kidnapping, as much as everybody's bending over backwards to say it has nothing to do with oil, echoing two oil men from Texas, or one Bush, and then of course Cheney. and Halliburton, the head of Halliburton, saying Iraq had nothing to do with oil, whether it's turning it on or turning it off to spike global prices. The idea that Venezuela has nothing to do with oil is comical, particularly given how brazenly and open the administration has been about all the minerals and deposits and things that are there and in other places, which we'll get to momentarily. Um, but the oil component, even Lindsey Graham, ultimate lapdog toady for Donald Trump, was trying to run interference with the press for him by saying that, oh, it's about narco trafficking, and it's fine when Honduras does it and other people we can pardon, but this is a problem. And then as soon as he's done trying to like clean up and shift the topic, Trump comes in bombastically and interrupts him and says, and the oil, it's also the oil. Like, I mean, he can't even get out of his own way, and
No, and
the
I mean,
press can't
and
clean it up.
to be honest, this is why a lot of liberals don't like Trump. It's not that they don't like his policy, because the amount of Democrats that have said this is a horrific act of war is, hold on, checking, nobody. They just don't like that he's so obvious about it. And again, like you pointed out with the launder, the how the media launders it. You know, the media isn't calling this an act of war, even though bombing a country and stealing their president is an act of war. These are acts of war, a coup, an invasion. But the way that this is framed, for instance, CBS said, ratcheted up, ratcheted up. The Wall
Yeah,
Street Journal called it a pressure campaign,
yeah,
and
a
and
pressure
CNN
campaign.
CNN called it an operation.
Yeah, I mean, again, yeah, and this is of course Adam Johnson was writing about this in the Intercept, of course, as far as we can rely on the independent press to cite or discuss these issues, but certainly not the corporate media, right? And of course, there's also some work in that article about legal framing and boy, some serious legal and mental gymnastics trying to bend over backwards and pretend that there's some legitimacy to any of this whatsoever, starting with, of course, the saber rattling, the murdering of people in boats in international waters. I mean, it really is just kind of bonkers, off the rails. And we remember back with Iraq and the false claims of WMDs, we now know that the Department of Justice, as what they call themselves these days, um, even said that there's no connections between Maduro and this mysteriously nefarious cartel that they can't seem to justify or locate or I mean again, I mean it's difficult to make things up because it's hard to keep up with their making things up.
And then just and this is also a shift. You know, they didn't come out right after we invaded Iraq and say there are no WMDs.
No.
Like it is a shift in policy and how brazen and how overt the powers that be are about it. They're like, yeah, actually, I had nothing to do. We just made that up. So what are you going to do about it? And this also makes the point of how people are comparing the lack of accountability with regards to Gaza with what's happening in Venezuela, and how this every time the state or the US empire does something and is never held accountable, it learns, you know, it's very Pavlovian. It learns like, well, I'll just keep going then, because there's nobody, I mean, besides a few like, you know, sternly worded statements or something, nobody's saying they're going to stop them.
No, in fact, we'll get to Stephen Miller again in a moment, um,
Mm.
who's basically saying out loud the same what you just said, that nobody
Mhm.
is going to stop them. Nobody is going to step in. I can't also help but remember um, going back to 1989, Operation
Yeah.
Just Cause, which I called Operation Just Because at the time when the U.S. went in to take Noriega, who was on the
Mhm.
CIA payroll, inherited to George Bush Sr. when
Yep.
he took over the CIA in the '70s, early '70s, and then of course all of a sudden he was running afoul of Washington, and so there was a whole operation. There's that word again. You could also call it an illegal invasion to kidnap somebody that was on the CIA payroll and drag them into Florida to put them up on drug charges that we were paying him to do, essentially.
Mhm.
The history, I mean, again, if it doesn't repeat, it certainly rhymes quite a deal. But we killed thousands of people in the
Mhm.
barrios of Panama City that got almost no attention, and we don't know how many yet people have been killed in Venezuela. with the recent antics and this kidnapping. So again, the press is very selective about their coverage, both historically and in the present. And this also, I can't help but be reminded of of Smedley Butler. At one point, the most
Mhm.
decorated Marine in U.S. history in 1935 wrote something called "War is a Racket." He was the major general in the Marine Corps, invaded most of Latin and South America for more than 30 years, right at the turn of the 20th century. And when he finally retired and was courted by a bunch of capitalists in a hotel in Philadelphia to overthrow the Franklin Roosevelt White House, he politely declined and said, "No, I don't think I'm going to do that." But the irony is of course, that he went on to write about how he did exactly that in
Right.
Latin America and South America for 3 decades. And in fact, he compared himself jokingly to people like Al Capone,
Mhm.
but bragging by saying, like, look, Al Capone was like kind of a big crime figure. He's like, I operated on multiple continents. I was cleaning house for the big banks, the national city banks. And in fact, he called himself a gangster for capitalism.
Yeah.
This is one of the most decorated Marines in U.S. history, calling it like it is in the 1930s. And here we are now, 90 years later, and we have people like one of Donald Trump's closest aides, Stephen Miller, uh, crawling back out of whatever hole he lives in, and says, uh, because Trump immediately upon this invasion, in Venezuela, Trump rattled off a casual list of other countries, by the way,
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
like just in a list in a cavalier fashion. He was like, by the way, Colombia, that guy's bad news. Cuba, we've got to get them. And then Greenland, we've got to take Greenland. And then there's people literally salivating on the side of the camera. They've got so many minerals. It harkens back to Afghanistan and the $1 trillion minerals there, along with the poppy trade. But I
Mhm.
mean, again, like you said a moment ago, not hiding it, in plain view, with full justification. And Miller recently then said, quote, "Nobody's going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland." He said this in a January 5 interview. And he said it wouldn't be military action against Greenland. Greenland has a population of like 30,000 people, Jake. He's talking to Jake Tapper.
Yeah.
It's actually double that, but nevertheless, we won't credit with Miller with understanding much about geography or political or
Or
otherwise.
anything.
Yeah, the real question is, by what right does Denmark assert control over Greenland? I mean,
I mean, that is a good
it's a
question,
good
like, it
question.
because I don't think that Denmark should control Greenland, but it's like that's kind of it's kind of the settler idea,
Yeah.
the settlers in Israel. "Well, if I don't steal your house, somebody else is
Somebody
going
else is
to."
going
It's
to
like,
take it
"How
before
about
we get
nobody
there.
steal the house?
Yeah,
How about nobody do it?"
it's pretty riveting. And I mean, even, Denmark's prime minister urged the White House to stop the threats. This is, you're getting into weird NATO territory here. Um, Obviously, according to these folks in Denmark and Greenland, they say it belongs to the people of Denmark and Greenland. Um, this again, this is unhinged. This kind of rhetoric is unhinged, and it gets back to that: is this the best we can do? Uh,
Well, and lest our listeners could forget this little gem, in February of last year, and I'm not kidding, I'm actually on the website of our dear Congress, House Resolution 1161, literally called Red, White, and Blue Land Act of 2025, was introduced last February to basically take control, and this was the Committee on Natural Resources. I wonder what that has to do with it, as well as the Committee of Foreign Affairs, of course. And basically to take over Greenland and rename it Red, White, and Blue Land. I'm not kidding. I actually don't even know what the Onion does anymore because this is a legit bill that was introduced to our Congress. Um,
yeah, I so again, it's out in the open for people that want to see it.
oh, yeah.
But the way in which the corporate media in this country cover things, that doesn't even seem to make a headline. That
Mm-mm.
this kind of alarming rhetoric. And again, on one level, we've heard corporate media types say, well, this inflammatory rhetoric is just that. It's designed to get a rise. It's designed to provoke the other side. And the GOP just wants to rile up the libs and own the libs. Um, Except half of Project 2025 that we were warning about has already been pretty much implemented. And going back 2 years, we were called crazy conspiracy theorists for bothering to read it and talk about it on the air, right? These things are kind of riveting. I know we have a few other stories and we have a break coming up, but I wanted to quickly take this opportunity, Eleanor, for a small history lesson. I had mentioned Smedley Butler prior, and I wanted to do our listeners a favor. I actually wanted to read a very brief quote from Smedley Butler,
Mm.
because the paraphrasing of it, I think, allows people to kind of maybe dismiss it or to say, oh, maybe you're letting on more than he said. I think the language is really important. And so before we duck out to a break and sort of shift gears topically as well, I wanted to read this passage from Smedley Butler in his work War as a Racket from 1935. Butler said, quote, I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 through 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. And that is none other than Smedley
Amen.
Butler. I'd like to
The
remind
confessions of an economic hitman decades before John
just
Perkins wrote his book.
before John Perkins came around and said it again. Exactly, Eleanor. And now maybe we can switch gears a little bit, though. I mean, I'm imagining something else could creep its way back in. But there are a couple of other stories that you've been looking at, Eleanor, and a couple things I think that are pretty significant. Freedom of the Press late last year did a report about how most journalist detainments were taking place at protests, and were taking place usually around protests about immigration raids. Can you talk a little
Mhm.
bit about this important topic?
Yeah, so folks will recall we just recently did an interview with Seth Stern and Lauren Harper from the Freedom of the Press Foundation. They do very important work over there, and part of their work is the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, and it basically documents attacks on the freedom of the press. And they documented as of December 15th of last year that 32 detainments or charges against journalists in the U.S. 28 of those were at immigration related protests. And the report notes how, unlike most years, the majority of journalists were released without charges or had them soon dropped, with law enforcement instead focusing on deterring news gathering rather than pursuing charges. And as somebody who has covered protests in the past and been arrested, I can say that this is a lot of the times what they do. They know they can't actually charge you with holding a camera, but they know that they can scare you, and they know that most people are not going to bring a suit against the cops for arresting them for holding a camera, because who amongst us has that kind of time and money? So instead, they're just hoping that you'll be scared enough so that you won't come back and cover this fill in the blank protest or action or what have you. And really, what this does is it doesn't just stop press from wanting to cover this, it stops people from wanting to do these actions, which is, of course, the point, right? It's to stop people from dissenting. Dissent is not allowed, even though that too is a constitutionally protected right, supposedly, but just like freedom of the press is, right? So this is a really important a thing that the Freedom of the Press Foundation has highlighted, and I think it also speaks to the place where we see the most violations against basic rights happening. Of course, with these masked marauders kidnapping people off of the streets in broad daylight, ICE and CBP. That's where we see the most obvious and blatant violations of those basic rights. And of course, that's where you'd want to see the most coverage. And this aligns with what, Seth and Lauren were talking about in that last segment that we did with them, which is also that press is not allowed in the courtrooms either, which is a very important place to be because you're covering the actual proceedings of the so-called Justice Department to deal with the people that ICE has kidnapped and scooped up off of the streets. And if you don't have access to that, you don't have access to the information about what's actually happening to these people. And then they get disappeared somewhere. You have no idea where they're going. Their family doesn't know. Press is a vital link of information between the community and the state. And when that is covered up, when that is buried, then that there's a complete lack of accountability, there's a lack of transparency, and people get disappeared, which is horrifying.
Yeah, and it's again, I urge folks to check out um, Freedom of the Press Foundation's pressfreedomtracker.us. This material is there. They're an invaluable org and make great efforts to inform the public about the assaults on the First Amendment, on journalists themselves. The study that we're talking about here now um, was published again last month at its press arrests used to silence protest coverage in 2025. But if you go and you check out the featured incidents they have at the site, you'll see there's a a series talking about the Trump administration's move to punish outlets during the second term as a matter of design, as a blueprint. We've certainly seen that laid out all last year, along with what we saw in in the Project 2025. We saw photojournalists arrested in Miami over at an immigration protest where gear is being seized. We see photojournalists denied entry into federal buildings. Again, it's almost as if there's a willy-nilly wanton display of violation, not just of rights of citizens, not just the rights of people living in the United States to due process, but against the messengers themselves, right? Where we've seen all last year, we saw example after example of either ICE or police literally shooting the messenger, literally attacking and shooting at journalists, at people clearly marked press, right, across the chest. And in a lot of ways, I'm not making a perfect analogy by any means, but the strategy of attacking the press and shooting journalists is unfortunately one of the things that we see happening in other conflicts in other parts of the world that's rather commonplace. Last year, I believe, was the highest number of journalists killed in combat areas on record, the bulk of it taking place in Gaza.
Yeah.
This is a press freedom issue, right? So even if people like to say, well, they're complicated issues between Israel and Hamas and Palestine or Russia and Ukraine, if we look through the prism of press freedom and the public's right to know in Article 19 in the Declaration of Human Rights about the freedom of expression and the right of the public to know what's going on, we see wanton violations across the globe. And unfortunately, the
Mhm.
most egregious violations that we saw have been committed by the Israeli government in Gaza and with the support of U.S. weaponry and tax dollars. And that's very unfortunate and very tragic. But it's certainly not anti-Semitic to note the factual evidence in the material that shows that there are attacks taking place on the Fourth Estate, and there are people conducting those attacks.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. And I'd actually, I mean, this actually is a kind of a perfect transition to talk about what happened. We're recording this on Wednesday, January 7th, by the way, so listeners are aware. Yesterday, Israeli forces opened fire with live ammunition at Birzeit University in the West Bank and injured 11 people. And if you look at one of the videos that was posted by Al Jazeera, you see an Israeli soldier raising his weapon specifically targeting somebody who's filming. It's clear that he's aiming directly at that person. And it is a perfect metaphor, a perfect and disgusting metaphor for exactly what Israel has been doing, shooting the messenger, as you pointed out, shooting the storyteller. Israel has also targeted poets and writers and artists because these folks get the word out of what really is happening on the ground, whether that be Gaza or, in this case, Birzeit University is just outside Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, and the crime that these students were committing on Birzeit University, what they were doing a sit-in, and they were going to see a screening of the Hind Rajab film. So that was their vicious crime that caused Israeli forces to come in and open fire with live ammunition. And again, the film is a form of reporting, of course, discussing and showing what Israel has done. And that's not allowed, right? This is a purposeful way of trying to shut down any kind of information sharing, any kind of looking behind this blood-soaked Hasbara curtain. And I spoke more about this with our guest Shir Haver last week, talking about Hasbara and the very large cracks in the Hasbara machine. But still, this is why Israel targets these truth tellers and these people on the front lines who have cameras, who have microphones, and it is grotesque, and it is also not surprising. And what also is grotesque, Mickey, is that right now I'm looking at a Middle East Eye report about the attack at Birzeit University by Israeli forces. If you look up CNN or MSNBC or New York Times, like crickets, nobody is reporting. I mean, and the Israeli forces are. If you look at the video, they're literally walking around. Like you see the videos of active school shooters in the U.S. Imagine that there was an active school shooting in the US at a university where people dressed like Rambo came onto campus and started firing live ammunition at students for watching a movie. Can you imagine that not being a headline news? And here it's not even. Corporate media doesn't even care, which again is not surprising when you consider the fact that Israel is in its umpteenth day of violating the so-called, very poorly termed ceasefire agreement, and continuing its genocide in Gaza, and corporate media could not care less. And so this is not only this is not lying. This is not only lying through omission. It is journalistic malpractice, and it is showing a complete lack of interest in that freedom of the press and the importance of sharing information, which then circles back to what we were originally talking about. Why would they not just parrot what the State Department says, or not use words like kidnapped? Because they're not interested in actually holding power to account. They're not interested in actually informing the public about what's going on. They're not interested in protecting the people or serving the people. They're interested in serving and protecting power.
Well, in addition to the ownership class not having interest in telling the stories, journalists learn quick lessons about what we refer to as the chilling effect, right? When colleagues see their peers being censored or fired or threatened in other ways, now we have violence, serious threats of violence that have come into play, even here in the United States. I say even with the aerial quotes. You and I know that it's not some kind of an anomaly, but many people out there listening, or many people in the United States, they don't think about this country in those kinds of terms. The Committee to Protect Journalists, as of January 6th, have somewhere around 250 journalists and media workers killed in conflict, a vast majority being Palestinian journalists in Gaza. Other numbers put it higher, closer to 300. But this is the deadliest conflict for journalists that's been on record. I just want to point this out contextually. The number of journalists that have been killed in Gaza just in the last 2 years exceeds the total number of journalists killed during the U.S. Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, and post-war 9/11 war in Afghanistan. So, um, I just let that float out there. I mean, again, people will say what they say and draw their own conclusions, as they should. But I think that if people had the evidence and they had the facts and they knew more about what was actually happening by looking at the stories that are being reported in the independent press that we're highlighting here, by looking at press freedom groups and their tracking of the actual attacks that are literally taking place against journalists across the world and here at home. I just wonder, like, how. I mean, there's a part of me that hopes sincerely that if people knew these things were happening, that somehow there would be more pressure, there would be more dissent, there would be more protest, there would be somehow more um, a more invigorating response from the so-called opposition party of the Democrats. I mean, you can definitely put aerial quotes around opposition there. Um, but I mean, it's pretty riveting. I mean, and again, I don't pretend to know all things about what's happening globally around the media and in the world of journalism. But the evidence that I've been seeing just even over the last year is alarming, even to people like me that have been studying this for a really long time. And so I find it kind of alarming that it almost seems, Eleanor, that we're in a state of shock or paralysis about
Mm.
what to do about it. Um, so maybe that's a theme that we can return to, of course, is the focusing on the solutions journalism angles and what we can do about it. I know you're going to be doing some on the ground reporting later on this year in some of the southern states around some really important things, so I'm sure we'll be highlighting those. But anything else you wanted to tag on or anything else you wanted to point out here in
Yeah, and
this
I think
segment?
I think, Mickey, it's important to highlight why the attacks on the press matter outside of it just being disgusting, because I think a lot of times people are like, "Well, why are we focusing on that as opposed to, the death of children or what have you?" And it's like, yeah, I we can first of all, we can do both,
Oh,
right? We can care about many things. I care about
yes.
my child and I care about my partner. Like that
Yeah.
we can do multiple things.
And we can even
But
care about each other's children.
right, exactly. As James Baldwin put it, all children are ours. And so I think what's important though is the understanding of contextualizing what the press is. If we understand the press as, again, like I said, our link of information, when we don't know, and that lack of knowledge can be deadly, the press should be, and many independent press is, our ability to know things and be able to act upon them before people die, so that people don't die, so that people don't get sick, so that this forest isn't clear cut, et cetera, et cetera. The press is a vehicle to change by providing necessary information to act upon. And that's why it's so important to focus on attacks on the press, because that is literally a canary in the coal mine. When they attack that, it's because they're doing things that they don't want you to know about, because they don't want you to act on that information.
Exactly. And looping back to the beginning of the program and the beginning of our segment, topically, it turns out that while President Trump did not talk to Congress or the Democratic Party leadership about the escapades in Venezuela involving Maduro, he did talk prior with the oil company executives, going back to our friend Smedley Butler, and he also talked to the New York Times and the Washington Post, who knew that the raid was going to take. I'm sorry, did I say raid? What was the word we were supposed to use? Yeah,
Operation.
sorry. They knew about the operation and they chose not to report it. And I have now already been seeing people in the press justifying their withholding of that information so not to jeopardize American lives and the lives of troops. But when you tell the press that you're going to violate international law and then you go and do it, doesn't the press have an obligation to say that? I'll just let that out there and let that
Yep.
float
Let's just
around.
let that sit.
We'll just let that sit. Anyway, Eleanor, as ever, it's always a pleasure to join you and cut it up about the state of our so-called free press. And we'll certainly be doing this at least once a month throughout the year. Stay tuned also for maybe a couple of other segments and things. We're going to try to jazz things up for y'all. And we certainly have our work cut out for us in 2026. So thanks to all of you for tuning in to the Project Censored show once again, and we'll see you next time.